Hello everyone. This video is going to be about rights and responsibility. I always debate with myself regarding whether or not I'm going to put this conversation in the beginning of the class or the end of the class. It's always interesting, I guess, the way that I decide what I'm going to do with this unit, because believe it or not, this unit causes more arguments or sparks more arguments than any of the other conversations that we've had. So we've discussed abortion, euthanasia, capital punishment, and even though those are cultural hot buttons or hot topic buttons, or hot button topics, sorry, this one actually sparks much more debate because many people never realize that they've had a misunderstanding of what a right is. And so this conversation usually sparks heated debate, which is one of the reasons why I have it at the end of the class, not at the beginning, after the definition of the human person and the nature of the human person, which is where I think it belongs in terms of the outline of the class. But this is a better spot to put it, the end of the class, because we know each other and you know me a little bit better, and you know what you probably have an idea of what I'm going to say. So when we're discussing rights, I guess there are so many different ways to approach this conversation. I could start with the definition of right, or, the definition of a right, or the history of rights, or the historical foundation of rights, or the historical definition of rights. And really, I think that's completely irrelevant to this sort of class. I mean, if you're taking a law, a law class, or any of those things, sure, or if you're, grad student, of course, we'll start with the history and the foundation of the definition of rights. But really, the only thing that an average American knows is, and to be fair, I'm taking for granted that, you're all Americans. There may be a class one day where I have some international students who don't quite agree with the American definition of rights, but really the average American believes, or has always been taught, that a right is something that is owed to you. It is owed to you. It is something that everyone must give you. And also every American has been taught that every human being has equal rights, or equal access to rights, which is not, of itself, I guess, a terrible definition. It's just that it's focused on the wrong aspect of rights. So let's start with, we'll talk about a little bit more, I guess the definition will come out through conversation or through the video, but let's start a little bit with Jacques Maritain. I know I've mentioned him before, but he is one of the most famous, most talented, most intelligent modern Thomists. And I really believe that he's really been ignored by most modern philosophers, which is quite unfortunate, because he's brilliant. And I want to remind you that I want to say I told you this in class, but I'm not sure. So I'll say it again, that Jacques Maritain was called upon to help draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after World War II. And there was a reason why he was chosen. I mean, he was one of several people who drafted the document, or helped to draft the document. But he was chosen specifically because he was a natural law philosopher. So he was known for the ability to discuss the definition of the human person, the nature of the human person, the nature of law, the nature of rights, without the need to discuss God, the Bible, Jesus, all of those things. Because what's really interesting about, this is my little soapbox, and I'll get off my soapbox when I'm done, I promise. But what's really, really fascinating about the modern understanding of rights is that it's a Christian idea. This whole idea of, all human beings are equal and have equal dignity and should deserve equal respect. That's a Christian notion that really wasn't around until the Christian movement. So before that, you had the concept of, men were more, had more rights than women, because men were more valuable to society. Or you had the concept of, the rich are more valuable to society, and they have more rights, and they deserve protection under the law, not the poor, or those who are impoverished. Or then you have this concept of, royalty. People who are royal and of noble birth have this, have greater rights, and so really this whole movement of, equal rights for all people and equal opportunity, that's a distinctly Christian idea. that has trickled down into America. But what's happened is that we've removed the idea of Christ and religion. We've removed all of that from our modern understanding of rights, and we've left this whole idea of everyone has equal opportunity to do what they want, which is really what, the American concept of a right is that I can do what I want. No one can tell me that I can't do what I want, or that, that I can't have what I want. So Jacques Maritain argues something vastly different. He argues that the idea of a right is bound to the idea of natural law, that, there is a law that governs human nature. We have the obligation to achieve our human nature, to act in accordance with our human nature, and that's where the law comes from, the natural law itself, but also civil law should flow forth from the natural law, and should coincide with the natural law, and that's where our rights, that's where our rights are derived. Our rights are derived from the obligation we have to achieve our human nature, to achieve the goal of humanity. So really the idea of a right is that no one should hinder you from achieving your human nature. So there are different types of rights when we're talking. This is just very brief overview. You have positive rights and negative rights. Positive rights are goods or actions that we can demand from others, and the negative is the realm of human existence that should remain free from attack and intrusion by others. So a positive right would be, I have the right to clean air, or I have the right to life. Negative right would be, I have the right to bodily integrity, so no one has the right to harm my body or intrude upon my body. Those are just easy. Obviously, there are many more concepts of positive and negative rights, but rights precede justice, and I want to make sure that I'm clear about that and that you understand that before we move on. That there would be no justice if rights did not exist. So rights come first, or human rights exist, and they are prior to the concept of justice. The concept of justice exists because human rights are authentic. So this slide, I guess I didn't realize this on the previous slide, but I pretty much explained this slide on the previous slide as well. I already explained that the rational foundation of rights is natural law, and that since man possesses a nature, every man has the obligation to achieve that nature. So man, this is from Jacques Maritain, man possesses the ends which necessarily correspond to his essential constitution, which are the same for all. So all human beings possess an end goal, i.e. achieving their human nature, or achieving, remember, the summum bonum. And this is the same for all human beings. We all have the ability to achieve our final ends, and we all have the obligation to do so. Morality exists because we can choose to reject our own nature. So right here, if you notice in this little tan box on the right, what's more important here is that we notice that human beings share the obligation to, the same obligation to achieve their ends, which is what I just said. But we also have to allow others to achieve these ends as well. This is where the whole concept of rights enters the picture. It really has nothing to do with what you want. Rights have nothing to do with what you want. They have nothing to do with your desires, I turn on the TV and right now, what's in the news right now, and maybe you'll notice it, maybe you won't. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, but maybe you've seen this on TV or, online, or maybe you haven't, I don't know. But there's a woman who is driving around in a truck with these big, huge letters that say, F Trump and F everyone who voted for him. And obviously she spells out the word. That's the one word that I probably will not say of all the things that I say. But there's this huge argument right now that's happening over whether or not she has the right to drive around, number one, on public property, number two, with obscene, obscene words, and then number three, a rude opinion. So really, when this woman was interviewed, she said, I have the constitutional right to say what I want. And I thought, and my first thought was, oh my God, no, you don't. You don't have the constitutional right to say what you want. I honestly appreciate your opinion. I don't really, I'm not going to have a political conversation with you right now, but really, what you want is not a right. Okay, I'm going to say that again. I don't know if I said that clearly, but your desires are not rights. Just because you want to say, F, Trump. Or, honestly, there were signs when, President Obama was president, F Obama. People said that too. So really the issue is not the political drive behind it. The issue is the manner in which you're saying it, or the manner in which you're expressing yourself on public streets. And so she argued that, the government doesn't have a right to tell her what to say. And then the other argument on the other side of the fence, because there were police involved, because people complained, their argument was, well, you're on public property and you can't do what you want on public property. You can't steal things. You can't say certain things on public property. It's not appropriate. And I agree. I kind of agree. I mean, I see what they're saying. They're correct that you don't own this land that you're using, or the streets that you're driving on. You have a license from the state. You don't have the right, what you believe is a right, to do what you want. You can have any opinion you want. You can express any opinion you want. I mean, I wouldn't have had a problem with this woman if she had said, Trump is a terrible president, or whatever, or Obama is a terrible president, whatever word you want to put there. You can express your opinions. There's nothing wrong with expressing your opinions, but the way in which you do it, is it conducive to human flourishing, or is it not? Are you, let's go back to, allowing others to achieve their human natures? By me driving around with this curse word, extremely obscene curse words, of all the curse words to use, am I helping other people achieve their human nature, or am I drawing them further and further away from it? And the way that I read this situation is, she's drawing people further and further away from achieving their final ends. If I have a 35, 36-year-old man or woman might be able to just look at that and think, wow, that's really rude. That I would never say something like that, and then look away. A 12-year-old, maybe not. A 12-year-old wouldn't have the ability to look away. A 12-year-old would find that really fascinating, because most 12-year-olds aren't allowed to use that word in front of their parents or in front of their teachers. Or in front of any adult for that matter. So really what's happening is she's using public land to bring about harm to the public good, which is the problem here. So just remember, guys, that any right that you think that you have, or that you claim that you have, remember that it has more to do with other people than it does yourself. So one other aspect of rights that I want to draw, to which I want to draw your attention, is the fact that rights precede any form of government or written legislation. I guess this is the old, joke of which came first, the chicken or the egg. Which comes first, the government, written law, or human rights? So which of these comes first? In the Thomist understanding of government and rights and natural law, the human rights precede anything else. Again, human rights precede anything else. The government, and this is one thing I tell all of my students, if you learn nothing else from me, ever, if you've heard nothing else that I've ever said, if you've never listened to anything that I've ever discussed, the one thing that I do want you to remember, number one, hear and remember, and hopefully take to heart, is that your rights do not come from the government. Your rights do not come from the Constitution. Your rights do not come from the laws that are created in the United States. There's a serious problem, and when you hear politicians, there are many, many politicians in America that will say something like this. They'll say something along the lines of, well, this person doesn't really have rights because this person's not an American citizen, when they're talking about immigrants. Or, well, the human fetus doesn't really have rights. They're not really protected under the Constitution. They're not mentioned in the Constitution. They don't have, they don't have full protection under the law because they're not people. Regardless of whether or not it's a person, or whether or not you want to have this argument about, whether or not a fetus is a person, the government of the United States does not determine what rights are owed to you. They determine some things like, whether or not you're allowed to drive, or whether or not you're allowed to go to certain schools or whatever. But they absolutely positively do not dictate the definition of life, and do not dictate value or dignity. This is a big argument when we're having a conversation about immigration. Just because you're not an American citizen, that doesn't mean that you don't have any rights. Maybe the American Constitution doesn't protect you under American laws, but the Constitution does not dictate value. Your value exists regardless of what any politician, or regardless of what the Constitution says, regardless of what any law says. So this is very, very, very important. The government does not dictate your rights. The government does not make your rights. The government does not determine your rights. Usually this is a bigger conversation in class, and I ask you this question down here in tan: what is the main problem or the main concern with this whole idea that the government or society itself dictates human rights, or the definition of human rights? Really, the answer is that when the government dictates your human rights, the government can decide which rights are owed to you and which rights are not. So there are certain situations where the government has ultimate control and starts to strip away human rights. I mean, I can think of extreme cases, hopefully that, will never happen again, but they did happen. Nazi Germany, communism, North Korea is happening right now, where the government dictates human rights. And that's a serious problem, because when you give that sort of power to the government or any sort of legislator, you're basically allowing these people to tell you what you're worth, which is absolutely incorrect. So your value precedes any existence of government or any power. Or any law that is ever created. Your dignity and your rights precede any of that. And make sure that that is protected, because when people don't protect that concept, this is when the government really starts to overstep its bounds. So there are further distinctions of rights that we'll be going through in the next two slides. I know that you've heard of inalienable rights. I know that you know what that is, alienable versus inalienable. I'm not really going to spend a whole lot of time on it, because you can read this yourself and then, answer the questions yourself. But really one thing that I want you to focus on is this whole idea of inalienable rights that are unable to be renounced. Okay, so everyone thinks of inalienable rights in terms of, other people can't take them away from me. No one has the right to take away my inalienable rights. But very few people remember or recall or understand even that inalienable rights are rights that cannot be renounced even with personal consent. And this comes from Martin O'Keefe, known from The Things That Are. The right to life is a perfect example of this situation, or an inalienable right. No one has the right to take away your right to life, but that includes yourself. You don't have the right to take away your own right to life. This is one of the reasons why suicide, is always such a grave sin, and used to be considered illegal. It still is, I believe, illegal, but I don't think anyone will charge you for it if you do not succeed. But you don't even have the right to give up your own inalienable rights. And this is interesting for most Americans who believe that they are in complete and utter control of their existence. They've been told by the law, by society, by the culture, by even our own Supreme Court justices in some cases, we've been told that we, at the heart of freedom, lies this inalienable ability to determine the definition of life for him or herself. And that's a problem, because we actually don't dictate life itself. We have not given ourselves life, and we don't give ourselves our own rights. Our human nature gives us our rights. So we ourselves can't even dictate which rights we have and which we don't. The foundation of rights is in human nature itself. So another distinction to discuss is the possession of a right versus the exercise of a right. When you have any sort of authentic right, there are two aspects to any authentic right. You've got the fact that you have this right, so this inherent ownership, versus the ability to exert universal acceptance of this right in a given situation. And sometimes what's really interesting about rights, or the exercise of rights, is that in some situations we have the right to exercise our rights, and in some situations we don't have the right to exercise that which we hold as a right. This is one of my favorite quotes from Jacques Maritain when we're discussing rights and human laws. If you look at the top little tan box, Maritain says, "We have especially a tendency to inflate and make absolute, limitless, and unrestricted in every respect the rights of which we are aware, thus blinding ourselves to any other right which would counterbalance them." This is fantastic, because I believe he's absolutely true. I mean, this is the modern American, that we believe that, like, let's go back to the woman who has her little F Trump sticker. Well, it's not even little, it's huge. It takes up like the whole back of her truck, or the back window. She believes, this is a great example. She believes that her right to free speech, is inflated. It's absolute. It's limitless. It's unrestricted in every respect. So what's happening is she's blinding herself to any other right which would counterbalance her right to freedom. So she's blinding herself to another person's right to not be exposed to that sort of lewd and obscene language. Another one that we would all agree on, maybe not so, controversial, is, it's illegal for you to yell bomb in an airport or an airplane or fire in a theater. Your right to say what you want is bound by other people's right to bodily integrity and safety. So if you are not, warning people of an authentic threat, you don't have the right to remove their comfort and their safety and their this concept of security in society. So here's where we get back into the purpose of the law. The purpose of the law and the purpose of the government is to ensure that the rights of all in society are respected, because more often than not, we have conflicts between authentic rights. So yes, this woman who has her sticker on the back of her truck has an authentic right to express herself. Absolutely. I would never ever say that she shouldn't have the right to express her political opinions, especially because I know people feel strongly, one way or the other, people feel very strongly about President Trump. I don't know many people who are kind of, in the middle. And so people have absolutely, they have the right to express themselves, but they have the obligation to express themselves in a way that is not damaging or detrimental to other people. Hopefully that makes sense. Another example that I'm giving you here in green is the criminal facing the death penalty. Yes, you have the absolute possession to the right to life or to your freedom and bodily integrity. However, you've lost the right to exercise that right to life and right to freedom because you have demonstrated that you can't use your freedom appropriately. So obviously we've had a long conversation about the death penalty, so I'm not going to go back there. But just remember, there is a difference between the possession of your rights and the exercise of your rights. So one last distinction when we're discussing the proper understanding of rights is we have the ancient and the medieval understanding of rights and the modern understanding of rights. The ancient and medieval focus really was the obligation of man. The focus shifted, in the ancient and medieval period to really this obligation that man has to the state. And you see that even in, we're talking ancient, so the Roman Empire. You really see this focus on the obligation to be a good citizen and your civic duty and things like that. And then, we've swung, the pendulum swung back in the modern period to focus on the inherent rights required by law, so required by natural law. So the modern idea has really almost discarded this idea of obligations that come with rights, whereas the ancient and medieval understandings focused on the obligation more than the individual rights that were owed to people. And I really wish that we would combine the two, so I have the little plus sign. Take the ancient and medieval understanding plus the modern understanding of rights, and we would have what I think would be a great comprehensive view of rights, where we would combine this appropriate understanding of both obligation and rights, and we would understand that our rights come with obligations and responsibility, which we'll discuss in a few slides. But please note this quote from Maritain, where he argues, again, that the same natural law which lays down our most fundamental duties is the very same law which assigns to us our fundamental rights. So again, he's arguing that you can't separate obligation from right itself, that they go hand in hand. So you may be thinking to yourself, well, why is it that no one has ever talked to me about natural law, about rights and obligations, about the proper understanding of rights? Why is it that I have, this modern cultural understanding of rights? And to be fair, I had the modern cultural understanding of rights before I started reading philosophy in grad school, actually. It wasn't even undergraduate, in which I started researching this or reading this. It was in grad school. And really the breakdown of rights started with the Enlightenment period. So you've got Hobbes and Locke, you've got Hume, Immanuel Kant, Rousseau, that really started this, a very different understanding of rights and also a very different understanding of the human person. So I'll read some of these quotes to you, and while we're reading this, think to yourself, Does this sound like America? Obviously, the answer is yes. So Thomas Hobbes argued that the fundamental right of freedom supersedes everything else. Freedom is unbounded and unlimited. Morality is nothing more than social construct. Rights are claims that we make against others. So he argues, look, my right to freedom is unbounded and unlimited. I do what I want. Unless society has determined, by however society determines this, unless society has determined that I can't do it, I should be able to do whatever I want. My rights are claims that I make against you, which is very interesting because Thomas Hobbes never really discusses the fact that other people's rights are claims that they make against me. So he never really discusses that. It's always, in the first person, whereas, rights are my claims that I make against you. It's never really turned around, which is fascinating with Thomas Hobbes. And then John Locke, of course, the father of liberalism, argued that rights are based on radical autonomy, meaning I am radically individual. I have this distorted idea of freedom, that I am alone, that I am the only one that matters. I guess Locke continues this idea, obviously continues the same idea of rights as Hobbes, but he also adds this claim that says that the government has to allow people the right to life, property, and liberty. And then unrestrained freedom of the individual is the basis of rights. So there's no here you don't see any concept of human nature, of the obligation. Remember how I always talk about how human nature itself is an obligation or presents an obligation. There's no concept of obligation in either of these two thinkers. It's really just unrestrained freedom, unrestrained desire. Whatever I want, that is a claim that I can make. The only thing that Locke does say is this right to life, property, and liberty, which is fascinating. What does that sound like? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what it sounds like, which is true. A lot of many of our founding fathers did read these philosophers, and so our Constitution does mirror this thought process. So here we have the nail in the coffin of natural law. And I'm quoting Maritain here, so I'm not going to be quoting Immanuel Kant and Jean Rousseau themselves. And I think, Maritain is fair of his assessment of these philosophers, but Maritain argues that the philosophy of rights ended up, after Rousseau and Kant, by treating the individual as a god and making all the rights ascribed to him the absolute and unlimited rights of a god, which is fascinating. I mean, the more I work with younger students, the more I see this. And a kid, if you talk to a student or, 16, 17-year-old, he or she is not going to call himself a god. That's not going to happen. He's not going to use that language. But he or she will behave that way. I do what I want. You're wrong. I'm right. If I don't like what you have to say, I'm going to turn you in, or I'm going to complain. I should have the newest, most valuable everything. It's all about me. I'm the only one on the freeway, and I drive like I'm the only one on the freeway, or I'm the only one on, in the hallway, and I walk like I'm the only one in the hallway. It's really fascinating to see that, of course, these children would never, because they're Christian, they would know that they should not call themselves gods, but they behave as if they are, which is kind of disturbing. Kant, now this is a direct quote from Kant in Maritain's book, Man and the State. Kant wrote that man is subject to no laws other than those which he gives himself. That could also be the democratic process. So we could say, Americans aren't subject to laws other than those that we vote upon, which is a problem because we vote upon some very interesting laws. In other words, man must obey only himself, as Rousseau put it, because every measure or regulation springing from the world of nature would destroy at one and the same time his autonomy and his supreme dignity. So people like Kant and Rousseau saw natural law, or this concept of natural law and human nature, as almost as an assault to, this radical autonomy or this radical dignity and freedom that a human being has. They argued that the dignity of man is in the freedom that he has, and this unlimited freedom that he has, and any sort of assault on man's freedom is an assault on his dignity. So really, for this understanding of human rights, there should be no laws that govern me except for the ones that I want, or the ones that I decide, or the ones that my society decides, which is problematic, as you can see. So, as a brief overview, what is the difference between the Thomistic understanding of rights and the modern and postmodern understanding of rights? We have Aristotle, St. Augustine, Aquinas, on the left, Kant, Hobbes, and John Locke on the right, the foundation of rights for Thomas Aquinas, and also, thus the morality which we put forth in this class, is natural law. Natural law is the foundation of human dignity and rights. Everyone is capable of knowing and enacting the demands of the law, which is, i.e., developing and cultivating virtue. You have an obligation to follow the natural law and to achieve your human nature. On the other hand, in modern and postmodern philosophy, human desire is the foundation of rights. Life is reduced to contractual interaction, and the purpose of the government is to ensure that popular ideas or rights or claims are enacted and protected. So the shift of this understanding of human rights really entered the picture with the modern and postmodern eras, and that really influenced the American culture and the American understanding of and practice of laws, at least on the legislative level, which is really interesting. So little, tidbit or little known facts is that when you're looking at the justices on the Supreme Court, they either hold one of these two beliefs. You either have, there's really very little middle ground on the Supreme Court. You've got these people who believe that law is an obligation, that virtue is an obligation, that human flourishing is an obligation. Obviously, here's the left, natural law. And I'm not using left in terms of a political word. I'm just saying left of the PowerPoint. And then you have other Supreme Court justices who truly believe the modern and postmodern philosophy of, that human desire is the foundation of rights. And that if enough people desire or claim a right, then it needs to be protected under the Constitution. So there's very interesting readings of the Constitution. And so if you ever study constitutional law, you'll have this argument a lot. Obviously, they won't call it natural law, so you really won't hear a lot about natural law in constitutional law classes. But you will hear, this whole concept of obligation and human flourishing. They'll never use the words natural law, but they will talk about human nature and human flourishing and things like that in constitutional laws discussions, which is interesting. So, just a little tidbit. So really, there's very little that I can say about this particular slide. Just go through and read it. Read the, rights are meaningless without obligations. Recognize that rights are tied to obligation to achieve one's final end. Just go ahead and read this and focus on this. And also think about these examples that I give you to yourself. What rights do you have regarding tobacco products? What obligations do you have? What rights do you have regarding marijuana or speeding or abortion? What obligations do you have? They go hand in hand. So just pay attention to this slide and spend a little bit of time on it for yourself. So the same goes for this slide as well. Read it and spend a little bit of time on it for yourself, because there is always, as O'Keefe argues, there really, in real life, there's always a conflict of rights and duties that, one authentic right of one person may come into conflict with the authentic, true right of another person. So how do we decide which ones should prevail? And so O'Keefe does have a ranking, which is, I believe, is appropriate to go ahead and read the ranking and make sure that you understand the ranking that he sets forth. So now this brings us to the function of each part of the state. When we think about the state, usually we think about, government or the society itself, but we really forget that the state is composed of persons and families first, that they are the foundation. So in the next slide, we'll go through the rights and obligations of each part of the state, or, in regards to the state versus families. But in here, I just want to quickly do the overview of the function of each. So the function of the state is to cultivate an environment in which all citizens achieve their ultimate end. You could say, in other language, an environment in which all human beings flourish, or all human beings have the ability to flourish. I'm okay with the language of, equal opportunities to flourish, things like that. And what's interesting is equal opportunity is not really fair. Because, to me, I think of the state in terms of my classroom, is that if I give students the equal opportunity to do anything, there's always those same kids who will take the opportunity and the same kids who won't. Some kids, the kids will do, the right things and the kids who won't. And so I look at that in terms of, me as the state and my students as the little persons, is that I have the obligation to force them to flourish, even when they may not want to flourish themselves. So equal opportunity isn't really fair, because equal opportunity really means that each person needs the equal opportunity to have the ability to flourish. And each person has a different level of flourishing, because what flourishing means for one person is not always the same as another person, because we all have different capabilities. But each person should have the ability to flourish in society. So now we get into persons and families. Their function is to contribute to the common good. So the state cultivates it and makes sure that it is, the common good is being protected. But the function of the person is to contribute to that and not expect the government to do everything. So we obviously contribute in various ways, and we have different abilities to contribute to the overall good of society. So a quick reminder that justice is that which is owed to someone else. The individual people have obligations to the state. The state has obligations to the people, and then people have obligations to each other, which is kind of funny. In America, we don't really think about that anymore. We don't really discuss that anymore. I feel like in the 60s, that was, on the forefront. I remember, was it JFK, not ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Which is, a little skewed, because the state exists for the sake of the people, not the other way around. We don't exist for the sake of the state. The state exists to help us flourish, not the other way around. So we're talking about the obligations of the state to people, that's distributive justice. We're talking about the obligations of people to a higher authority, i.e. the state, that's legal justice. And then the obligations that people have among equals, that's commutative justice. We can make this smaller in terms of, me versus my boss. I mean, the same idea exists. So there's, the obligations that I have to my boss, it's legal justice. The obligations my boss has to the employees is distributive. And then the obligations that I have to my colleagues, that's commutative justice. So really the obligations of the state towards the people is that they need to ensure that persons are protected and that they can achieve their final ends of human dignity, respect the dignity of each person, obviously protect education and economic sectors, enforce law and social contracts that people make among themselves. Of course, the state has its own rights, so they can have the right to continue their own existence, make decisions concerning the common good of the people, and also, I guess I should include here, is the right to self-defense. The state has the right to defend itself against unjust aggressors. We're talking about the people to the state. We have the obligation to support the existence of the state with taxes, defense, and further families, larger families. We don't really discuss this anymore. This is not something that the average American hears. We don't discuss any sort of obligations that we have to America. Honestly, growing up, I'm not that old, but growing up, no one ever talked to me about any sort of obligation that I had to America. No one ever told me about being a good citizen, about voting. No one ever talked to me about those things, or about, obviously you have to pay your taxes because, you go to jail if you don't. I did hear that, but no one ever told me about the benefit of taxes and how everyone benefits from taxes. And these are public goods that we use, like roads and libraries and schools. And no one ever talked to me about the obligations that I have to the state. I have the obligation to contribute to the common good of society. I also have the right to protect my own dignity if the government does not protect it themselves. And also I have the right to productive, fulfilling work and religious liberty. So we're talking about persons among themselves. Obviously, this is commutative justice because we are equals. I have the obligation to respect the life and liberty of my neighbors and actively help others when I can. This means that when I make contracts with them, I should honor my contracts, honor my word. And then also I have the right to remain free from harm and harassment. So if I have that right, other people have that right as well. So all human beings in the state have the right to remain free from harm and harassment. So when we're discussing social rights from Martin O'Keefe, he does outline all of these different rights and obligations that we have within the state. He uses, I think, really interesting examples and has interesting conversations about contracts and voting, speech, telling the truth. That would be a great place to start when we're discussing the woman with the stickers on the back of her car or her truck, education and work. I'm going to be honest with you, the final exam is not going to focus on these little minute details, but these are interesting if you are interested in these topics. So you can go and read those for yourself. And really, these last two slides shift gears quite a bit. We turn into the morality of war. This is relevant because, I guess, to the state and society, because only the state can dictate war or can declare war. War of itself can be considered a right. Let's, I guess, first get into the definition. War is a hostile act carried out by the authority of the state itself against some other state. So obviously, war is not carried out on the people, it's carried out upon another state. There's obviously some degree of force and the intention of imposing the state's will on the enemy. Now, Aquinas considers war a vice. It is a vice against the virtue of charity. But one thing that you need to notice or pay attention to is that war is considered a physical evil. It's not always a moral evil. Obviously, it's a physical evil because people die. But there are such things as just wars and wars that are appropriate. Typically, when we're talking about an offensive war, offensive wars are difficult to discuss because offensive wars can sometimes be morally evil. So if we're going on the offense because we want a natural resource from another government, obviously that would be immoral because we don't have the right to go into another country and take something that's theirs by force. We don't have that right. However, if we're going on the offense to protect the rights of the citizens in another country, then absolutely this war is moral because we are protecting life. So World War II, perfect example. Defensive wars are easier to discuss because for the most part defensive wars are considered self-defense. And we have the state and the people of the state have the absolute right to self-defense. Don't forget, though, there are certain requirements that must be met for a legitimate self-defense. So when we're talking about the state's right to war, I use the term just war, and just warfare is complicated. You can take entire classes on just warfare. And I also find it interesting, but the principle of double effect does apply. Remember, principle of double effect, that there's a good outcome and a bad outcome, or a good and evil outcome in any one situation. And this is when you apply the principle of double effect to determine whether or not a situation is moral. The same is true for war. If war is to be tolerated, it must meet the requirements of the principle of double effect. So here I reminded you of the principles of double effect here. So when we're talking about any sort of war, any war that America has ever encountered, so Vietnam, World War II, and the use of nuclear weapons, the war on terrorism, which was still happening, it must meet all requirements of the principle of double effect. So, and also when we're talking about a just warfare, Thomas Aquinas outlines what he calls the appropriate or the principles in which a war can be deemed just or appropriate or moral. War can only be declared by those with appropriate authority. So I can't declare war. I don't have that right. Only the state has the right to declare war. And I guess in our situation of America, it'd be the federal state. The federal government has that right. Individual states do not have the right to declare war. I guess they could, but they'd no longer be a part of the United States. A just cause must be present in order for a war to be declared. And those declaring war should have the rightful intention, meaning, protection of life, protection of dignity, or some sort of protection in general. So there really should not be any sort of state going out and exerting its authority over someone else without good reason or good cause or just cause. So other considerations for war is that really that war should always be a last resort. And in today's modern era, we do have the ability to discuss things peacefully. Obviously, that doesn't always work with some countries, but we do have the ability to attempt that. The rights that are defended must be fundamental. So when for example, if we happen to decide to go into Saudi Arabia to take their oil, number one, that would be a catastrophe. But if we're going in and starting a war because we want the right to oil, that is not a fundamental right. We don't have the right to take their oil. It's not theirs. It's not ours. And yes, the way that we live has made us dependent upon oil, but it's not a fundamental right that we have. That is their resource. So if we're going into another country to defend human life there or to defend American life, well then yes, that's a fundamental right. They're vastly different. The war must be conducted with the hope of peace. Obviously, hopefully that makes sense. So we don't want to be at war all the time. And there must be an actual chance of success. I mean, we're not going to, I mean, one thing to remember, and I think a lot of presidents forget this, which is unfortunate, but there are, American lives that are being lost, sons, daughters, husbands, mothers. These are lives that will never be they'll never be returned. And so this whole idea of sending in troops without this chance of success is unacceptable, because there are human lives at stake on both ends, American side and on the enemy side. So there's life at stake on both sides, and the damage must be proportional to the outcome in terms of nuclear war. This is one of the reasons why nuclear war or nuclear weapons are never considered a moral option, because the damage that it inflicts is much worse than the peace that it can bring, so damage, I guess, the damage of a nuclear war is generational. It's not just, with a bomb, you have, buildings that are damaged, obviously, wildlife that's damaged, and human beings that are lost or, harmed. But for the most part, once a regular bomb is dropped, the damage is done, and it can, it begins to heal immediately, or the world begins to heal immediately. With nuclear warfare, that is absolutely not the case. That the damage that is inflicted upon the world in terms of nuclear warfare is immense, and it's generational in regards to, that land is never going to be the same. Those people, never going to be the same. Anyone who lives in the area, 50 years or more, anyone who lives in that area will be harmed by the dropping of a nuclear war. So really, the damage that we're causing must be proportional to the outcome. And in terms of nuclear war, that is never, ever possible.